Okay, so can you see my screen? Okay, so I will start. So today, let me just. All right, so today we will study lipids, uh, and that will conclude our macromolecules, and then we'll talk about how these macromolecules are actually organized into cell structures and the cells. So lipids are collectively called as fats. So these are hydrocarbons that are insoluble in water. So they are insoluble in water because they have non-polar covalent bonds. They have non-polar covalent bonds, and they kind of aggregate together, preferentially if you put them in a water which is polar. So oil, ghee, all these are lipids that when you put them in water, they actually collectively aggregate away from water. So they are hydrophobic. They are hydrocarbons I mentioned because hydrogen and carbon, they have very similar electronegativity. So there is no delta positive or delta negative or partial positive or partial negative charge on the carbon and hydrogen. So that's why they are non-polar. So they're hydrophobic, as I mentioned. They are water hating. They are used as energy reservoirs. We store energy in the form of fats and oils as well. In addition to the glycogen and starch that I mentioned in my previous lecture, plant seeds have oil in them. That's a form of energy stored in the form of oil. Uh, they also play very important structural role in our cells. For example, the boundary or the envelope of the cells is actually made up of phospholipids. So they have very important role in our cells. Similarly, many lipids, they are required, they help capture the energy. For example, the chlorophyll molecule or the carotenoids that give color to many carrots as well as tomato. These are carotenoids, so they are lipids as well. uh, Similarly, they have very important regulatory roles. The many of the hormones in our body, for example, estrogen, progesterone, or testosterone, these all hormones are actually lipids. Similarly, vitamins are kind of lipids as well. Uh, they serve as thermal insulation. Fat in the animal bodies, polar bear, for example, has a very thick layer of fats. Similarly, they repel water on the surface of the skin, fur, and feathers. This is oil or wax on the feathers or the skin of birds, for example. Also, a very important role of lipids is that they serve as electrical insulator in nerve cells. What that means is that your nerve cells, they have kind of a wire, a long thread. We'll talk about later, and it acts like electrical wire that has copper inside. So similarly, when you see electrical wire that has copper inside and they're surrounded by the plastic, these nerve cells have lipids wrapped around them that serves as an insulator. Okay, so all of these functions, very important functions, are mediated by lipids. So simple lipids are actually triglycerides. What does that mean is that they have a glycerol molecule. So glycerol molecule looks like this, and then this binds with various fatty acids. So fatty acids are hydrocarbons that have a carboxylic group. Sorry, they have a carboxylic group on one side, and then they have a long kind of hydrocarbon chain. So this can be up to 20 carbon long. At the end, you have a CH3 group. Similarly, there are fatty acids that attach to this hydroxyl group and the fatty acid that attach to this hydro group. So remember, we talked about the condensation reaction. So what's happening is that this hydroxyl group actually reacts with this hydroxyl group when your water is released in a condensation reaction. And then as a result, you get a, you know, attachment of lipid, these fatty acids to the glycerol molecule. So I talked about just one, but actually this happens with all of the hydroxyl groups. The third one as well. And this is your triglyceride. So that has, three fatty acids. These are fatty acids. So fatty acids are long chain hydrocarbons. So this has three fatty acids attached to a glycerol molecule. So that's why they're called triglyceride. So this is an example of triglyceride. वही जो मैं अभी draw कर रहा था. So you have this glycerol molecule and these three fatty acids. So these three fatty acids, their carboxylic group here attaches with the hydroxyl groups of the glycerol molecule, and this gives rise to these, triglyceride. And this reaction is a condensation reaction, and this bond is called ester linkage. Okay, so up till now, that actually concludes our linkages for the macromolecules. So okay, so we studied four type of condensation reactions. We said that the amino acids, they're linked together by the peptide bond, and this actually results in polypeptides. Then we studied that the monosaccharides, they are linked together by the glycosidic bonds, and that actually results in polymers called polysaccharides. Third one, we studied that your nucleotides, they are linked together by phosphodiester bonds, and that results in formation of nucleic acids. Now here, for the lipids, we're studying that glycerol and fatty acids, they are linked together by the ester linkages or bonds, and that results in triglycerides. So this kind of concludes our, macromolecules. So these peptide bonds for the amino acids, glycosidic bonds for the carbohydrates, phosphodiester bonds for the nucleic acids, and ester linkages for the triglyceride. So four type of condensation reactions that we've studied in this course. We studied. So your fatty acids can be saturated or unsaturated. You might have heard, that the unsaturated fatty acids are healthy for you. The plant-based fatty acids are unsaturated, and the animal-based fatty acids are saturated. So your unsaturated fatty acids are healthier. They are liquid at room temperature. For example, your animal fats are usually solid at room temperature, whereas the plant fats are liquid at room temperature. So why is that? Because in the saturated fatty acids, you have a single bond between the carbon atoms. So this carbon and this carbon are only sharing one electron with each other. So one electron from this carbon and one from this. So they're only sharing, between them two electrons. Similarly, these are only sharing one electron each. So they are sharing one electron each. So the bond between carbon and carbon is a single bond. In the unsaturated fatty acids, some of the bonds are double bond. Double bond means that one carbon is sharing two electrons and the other carbon is also sharing two electrons between themselves. So that means, they only have one more uh, electron shared with the hydrogen. And this actually gives a kink to the, so you see here the fatty acid chain is straight. Here the fatty acid chain is, like this. So this means if I put these fatty acid chains together, they can tightly pack with each other. So इनको मैं tightly pack कर सकता. However, if I put these together, so this will be difficult to tightly pack them. So because they can't be tightly packed, they are usually liquid at room temperature, and they are readily packed together. They are solid at room temperature. So banaspati ghee is made by hydrogenating the unsaturated fats. So it's obviously very unhealthy to consume. Okay, another very important type of lipid is phospholipids. So these phospholipids, they are very similar to the other lipids. They have a, kind of a glycerol molecule, and they have fatty acid or hydrocarbon chains attached to them. But to the glycerol molecule, there are some hydrophilic head groups attached. So that means they have a polar head group, and then they have hydrophobic chains. So if I just can draw, yes. So they have a polar head group, and then they have a hydrophobic chain. So this is hydrophobic. This part is hydrophobic, and this is hydrophilic. So आपका जो polar है, that is hydrophilic. जो non-polar है, that is hydrophobic. So this head group is hydrophobic, hydrophilic, and this part tail is hydrophobic. So if you see here, so you can draw these lipids uh, as as molecules like this. So when you put these molecules in water, so when you put these phospholipids in water, what happens is that the hydrophobic part of the lipid goes away from water. So if the hydrophobic part goes away from water and the hydrophilic part faces the water. So hydrophilic kaun sa hai? Let me make it more clear with a different color. So this part is hydrophilic. Hydrophilic. So is this part. So this part is also hydrophilic. So water की तरफ, इस तरफ अगर water है, इस तरफ अगर water है, the hydrophilic part is facing towards, away from the water is their hydrophobic part. So this part, the tail is hydrophobic. This is also hydrophobic. So the tails, they face each other. So ये इस तरफ face कर रहा है, ये इस तरफ face कर रहा है, और जो hydrophilic part है वो opposite face कर रहा है. So that actually means if you put lots of these phospholipids together, they actually make a membrane. So your plasma membrane, cell की जो boundary है, that is actually made up of these phospholipids that have a hydrophilic head group and a hydrophobic tail. So you see, this is how they are arranged. So water is on the outside, so the hydrophilic part faces the water here, और जो hydrophobic part है ये वाला, वो faces away from water. So this is how your plasma membrane is actually made. Another very important group of lipids are carotenoids. These are pigments that trap light energy found in plants and animals. For example, this beta carotene can be broken down into vitamin A, two molecules of vitamin A, and this vitamin A can be converted into a pigment called retinal or cis retinal. So this cis retinal is the pigment that actually detects light in my eye. आपकी आंख में जो the reason you are able to detect light is because of this pigment. So the old saying that you should eat carrots to improve your eyesight has some merit, because the carrots, they provide you with carotenoids which can be broken down into vitamin A, and this vitamin A can be converted into retinal. Okay, am I clear? Okay, and then there are other lipids as well. For example, there are steroids such as cholesterol, very important for our cell membrane. Similarly, you have vitamin A, which is part of the rhodopsin I just described, is converted into retinal. You have vitamin D that is required for the absorption of calcium from the small intestine. You have vitamin E that protects cells from the damaging effects of the redox reactions, and vitamin K that's involved in blood clotting. Okay, so this kind of concludes our macromolecules. To summarize again, I will say we studied four type of macromolecules. Three of those are formed by the polymers of monomers, and those three are कि आपके जो amino acids hai, they form proteins through polymers hai. Your number two is your monosaccharides. They form polysaccharides. These are also polymers. Number three is your nucleotides. They form nucleic acids. These are also polymers. And the fourth one is actually your glycerol lipids. So lipids are actually, let me just, so lipids are actually not really polymers as such, but they kind of, because of the hydrophobic interaction, they can sort of form large structures. For example, I just gave you the example of membrane. So that's not, they're not covalently attached to each other, but they can still aggregate into large complexes. So lipids can aggregate into large complexes. So these three are polymers, and this is not a polymer, but all four are macromolecules. So this concludes our, macromolecule parts. So now we will see how, these macromolecules obviously constitute a cell. So now in the next part of this lecture, we'll see at, the cells. So we studied the characteristics of life in the first lecture. We talked about the chemical complexity, growth and reproduction. We talked about ability to refashion compounds from the environment, so they can take, living organisms can take compounds from outside and repurpose them for their own function. They can move substances in and out of the cell. They can extract energy from their environment. So all these characteristics are actually characteristics of the cells. So cells are the basic fundamental units of life. Okay, every organism that we know of actually is made up of one or more cells. So from unicellular organisms like bacteria to multicellular organisms like humans that have anywhere between 30 to 100 billion cells. So you can see everything we are made up of is actually cells. So cells are the basic fundamental units of life. And in 19th century, a cell theory was proposed, And there are three important points in the cell theory. The number one is the cells are fundamental units of life. Number two is all the organisms are composed of cells. The two things that I just talked to you. And number three, very important, is that all the cells, they come from pre-existing cells. So cells, you cannot make a cell. So any cell, all the cells in my body came from my parents. The cells in their body came from their parents. So similarly, you can trace the lineage to the first cell that was formed on this planet. Okay, so the continuity of life is maintained in the form of cells. So cells, they reproduce, they make new cells, and that is what defines the continuity of life. Okay, so all the cells are similar in composition. We talked about they. We will actually learn in this lecture that all cells have similar components. uh, you know, they contain complete set of information that can be replicated and passed during the cell division. So when a cell divides, so let's say this is a cell that contains genetic information in the form of DNA. So when it makes new cells, that is two copies of itself, then these cells have exact copies of the DNA. So उसके अंदर जो genetic information है, उसकी exact copies दोनों cells के अंदर है. ठीक? So this is very important. Okay? When cell divides, it gives the same genome to its daughter cells. In some cases, for example, in the cases of gametes, half the information is shared, but we can talk about that when we study mitosis and meiosis. Now, viruses, lack a cellular structure, but they also share some characteristics. They have the nucleic acids, DNA or RNA. SARS-CoV, for example, has RNA as a genetic information. They evolve, they reproduce, although they require a host cell to reproduce. Okay, so they need a host cell to reproduce. They need host cell for their metabolism as well. So some people don't consider them as living organism, but they actually share many characteristics of the living organism, including mutations and evolutions that we are actually now seeing for the COVID-19 virus. Similarly, the cells, they require energy. They require energy to grow. They require energy for their normal function. They require energy to divide into two different cells. Okay, so there are two different types of two cells. All the cells we can divide into two different types. One are called prokaryotic cells. So karyon means a nucleus. So these are prokaryon. They means before the evolution of nucleus or arrival of the nucleus, and then eukaryotic cells that have the nucleus. So there are two types of cells. Nucleus is a kind of enclosure that contains DNA or the genetic information. So for example, if I have two cells, in the prokaryotic cell, the genetic material will be lying in the cell without any compartmentalization. In the eukaryotic cell, the genetic material will be enclosed by a membrane-bound structure called nucleus. So nucleus is a membrane-bound structure. Okay? So it's like a football. So you can give an example of apart from the nucleus, the eukaryotic cells have all other membrane-bound structures as well. These membrane-bound structures are called organelles. Okay, so various membrane-bound structures are present in eukaryotic cells. In prokaryotic cells, there are no membrane-bound structures. So this is kind of a major definition. Okay, so you can consider like, if you have a big hall that has no room inside, so that is more like a prokaryotic cell. In the eukaryotic cell, it's like a big house that has, division of labor. That means, one room is where you keep all your money. One room is where you have the kitchen that produces food that you eat. One room is, your washroom where you get rid of the waste products. So, things like this. You can say prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. Okay, So cells can be of different shapes and sizes. For example, your red blood cells, they don't have a nucleus. The smooth muscle cells, they look like this. Your new nerve cells or the neurons, they look like this. So they can extend up to 1 meter. So your prokaryotic cells, they range from 1 to 10 micrometer in size. So micrometer is 10 to power minus 6. So 1 millionth of a meter, right? Your eukaryotic cell is from 10 to 100 micrometer. So, our human eye, we can see things that are, 200 micrometer in size with our naked eye. 200 micrometer is 0.2 millimeter. आपने रूलर देखा है ना, उसके अंदर एक सेंटीमीटर है, सेंटीमीटर has 10 millimeters. So we can see details up to 0.2 millimeter. So cells are very small. Most of the cells you don't see by naked eye. So you have unicellular organisms like diatoms or paramecium, or you have these microbes, for example bacteria that are round, that are rod shape, or that are spiral shape. So different shapes of all the different types of cells. Even human body has around 200 different types of cells. Okay, and all of these, they have different shapes and sizes. Okay, so as I mentioned, there are two types of cells. Your prokaryotic, they lack a nucleus. Examples are archaea and bacteria. And then eukaryotic, they have a nucleus. So if we compare them, they kind of actually, let me go back. Okay, so how does a cell actually look like? So let me, draw you a cell. So a eukaryotic cell in this case. So let's suppose we have, a boundary of the cell. We say a cell has a boundary, and boundary is made up of, I just talked about this, boundary is made up of plasma membrane, and plasma membrane is made up of phospholipids. So this is a lipid bilayer that we can say is surrounding the cell. Cells can have different shapes. So let's suppose this is a large eukaryotic cell that I'm trying to draw. So this structure outside is your membrane. Remember, I just told you a membrane. Okay, let me change the color. That a membrane is made up of phospholipids. So phospholipid is like hydrophilic part that is facing the water, and then it has hydrophobic tails that are facing towards each other. Okay, so all this that I draw here is your phospholipid. So I'm not going to draw this all of it, but you can imagine how it looks like. And then we said eukaryotic cell has a big a nucleus inside, and this nucleus is also surrounded by the membrane. Okay, so there's a nucleus inside which is also surrounded by the membrane. So let me draw this. So okay, so and the nucleus has nuclear pores. So ये जो है आपको नजर आ रहे हैं, this is like a pore. I mean, this is in two dimensional, but you can imagine this is like a football. Okay, a football like this, and this is a cross section. So you see, they have nuclear pores. This can be 9 nanometer in size, and many molecules can pass these nuclear pores. And inside the nucleus, you have all the genetic information that a cell carries. So you have these kind of, chromosomes that are bound to proteins, and these are present inside the nucleus. Okay, so this structure that I just draw here is your nucleus. And a part of the nucleus is actually very densely packed like this. So it has a dark color, it's densely packed. This structure is called nucleolus. Okay, so this structure we'll talk about later is where your ribosomes are synthesized. But for now, you just need to know this is a nucleus that contains the DNA, and some of the DNA is densely packed into one part that is called nucleolus. Okay, next, we have other membranous structures inside the cell. So this is, remember, this is membrane, this is your plasma membrane. This is also membrane. This is your nuclear membrane. Okay, and then you have other membranous structures. These are, dense structures throughout the, they can be present, highly branched, hollow structures, अंदर से खाली हैं ये, and these are called endoplasmic reticulums. क्या कहते हैं इनको? And each one of these has a double membrane. So यहाँ पे double membrane है. I'm just drawing it for, phospholipid bilayer है. So ये इस तरह से. Okay. So मैं उसे simply draw कर रहा. So these can be present throughout the cell. So these are called endoplasmic reticulum. They have very many different types of functions we'll discuss later, and there are actually two types of endoplasmic reticulum. One that contains these bound structure, these round structures called ribosomes. So जो ribosome containing endoplasmic reticulum है उनको हम कहते हैं rough endoplasmic reticulum. Okay, so the endoplasmic reticulum that have ribosomes bound onto them, they are called rough endoplasmic reticulum. And the endoplasmic reticulum that don't have the ribosomes bound to them, they are called smooth endoplasmic reticulum. क्या कहते हैं उनको? Smooth endoplasmic reticulum are those that don't have ribosomes bound to them, and rough endoplasmic reticulum are the endoplasmic reticulum that have ribosomes bound to them. So these are ribosomes. Okay, now you have another structure that is also made up of flattened discs, and this structure is called Golgi apparatus, right? So this is also membrane bound structure, and the proteins actually go to the Golgi, and then from Golgi they are packaged and exported to different parts inside the cell. And then you have very important structure called mitochondria. So mitochondria are 1.5 micrometer in diameter, and they can be 8 micrometer in length. Okay, so they have two membranes. One is outer membrane and the other is inner membrane, and they are kind of the powerhouse of the cells. So all the energy that cell utilizes actually is generated in the mitochondria. So mitochondria provide energy. Some of the cells in our body that require a lot of energy, for example, our liver cells, they can have 1,000 to 2,000 mitochondria per cell. So large number of mitochondria. Okay, and then so mitochondria are like a kitchen in a house, right? But you also need another organelle, that is your lysosomes. So lysosomes are also membrane bound structure. So these are lysosomes, and these lysosomes are actually responsible for degrading and recycling the product. So cells को जिस चीज की जरूरत नहीं होती जो उनसे मैक्रोमोलिक्यूल्स की, they send them to lysosomes. Lysosome breaks them into small units and they can be then reused. So lysosomes are very important kind of recycling compartments. And then you have a similar compartment called peroxisomes. उनका भी इसी तरह का रोल है. Peroxisomes. Now, your whole cell also has many structural components. So ये तो उसके organelles है. So organelles are these compartmentalized structure or membrane bound structures that perform different functions inside the cell. So if I say what are the organelles inside the cell, you will say nucleus is an organelle. You will say endoplasmic reticulum is an organelle. You will say your Golgi apparatus is an organelle, or your mitochondria, or your lysosome, or your peroxisome. These are organelles. Okay. Now, cells also have structure that or proteins that provide structural integrity to the cell, and these are called microtubules. There are three types. One is called microtubules. So your microtubules are long filamentous structures. Okay. So your microtubules are long kind of filamentous structures that span throughout the cell. So सारे cell के अंदर जाते हैं. So they are present throughout the cell and they originate from a certain place. So within the cell, they originate from one place. So like you can see, they are all originating from here. So this place where they originate from is called microtubule organizing center. So this place is called mTOC, या इसको हम सेंट्रोसोम भी कहते हैं, सेंट्रोसोम. Okay, so this place is where your microtubules originate. Similarly, cell has another structural component that is present near the membrane. So this kind of gives structural integrity to the membrane, so the membranes don't fall or fold over, and these structures are called actin filaments. So ये ग्रीन वाले जो थे ये इनको हम कहते हैं माइक्रोट्यूब्यूल्स. माइक्रोट्यूब्यूल्स. और ये जो रेड वाले हैं which are present near the surface, they are called actin filaments. So these are actin. A third structural component that is present inside the cell is called intermediate filament. So they also provide structural integrity to the cell. They are also present in the nucleus के अंदर वाली membrane के ऊपर भी होते हैं, and they are called intermediate filaments. Okay, so this is kind of an overview of a eukaryotic cell. So if I list all the things, you can see there's nucleus, nucleus, there are endoplasmic. So nucleus का क्या function है? It contains DNA. जितना भी सेल के अंदर DNA है, most of it, actually some mitochondria के अंदर भी होता है, लेकिन most of the DNA it contains in the form of chromatin. So chromatin is when your DNA is wrapped around protein. So let's suppose this is a protein and your DNA is wrapped around it. This will be called chromatin. Okay, so your DNA is present in the form of chromatin. And then you have endoplasmic reticulum. वो हमने कहा दो है, एक रफ है और एक स्मूथ है. Number third, we talked about Golgi. apparatus. Number 4, we said you have mitochondria. Number 5, we said you have lysosomes. Number 6, you said peroxisome. Number 7, we said cytoskeleton. उसके अंदर हमने कहा 3 चीजें हैं, माइक्रोट्यूब्यूल्स है, एक्टिन फिलामेंट्स है और इंटरमीडिएट फिलामेंट्स. Okay, so let's see, this is a comparison of plant cell, animal cell, and bacterial cell. So you see, in bacterial cell there is no nucleus, the chromosome is present in the middle, they do have ribosomes. So I won't go into detail of this comparison, but what I really want to show you is, actually I'll skip that, is some of the characteristics of some of these components of the cells. So for example, your plasma membrane, very thin structure, it forms the outer surface of every cell. It has more or less same thickness and molecular structure in almost all of the cells. Composed of phospholipid bilayers. We talked about what is phospholipid bilayer. Now plasma membrane, आपके घर को अगर कोई चीज आपकी boundary wall अगर surround कर रही है, तो that means it is protecting your cells, right? So your plasma membrane kind of protects the cells. It contains the contents of the cell into certain place. So it also provides a selectivity barrier. When you make a house, you put a door outside, you put a gate outside. That means it will allow some people that you want to come in to come, and not everybody can come into your house, right? Similarly, your cells have this plasma membrane that allows some things to come in and doesn't allow the other things to come in. It also allows to maintain a constant internal environment. It's important for communication with other cells. Like in a house, you have a door, and that allows you to communicate with other people as well. You can let some people come in, or you can go out and talk to other people. Also has a structural role in maintaining the shape of the cell. In terms of nucleus, we said it contains DNA. Your DNA is bound to the protein, and this makes what I said, it makes chromatin. And this chromatin is organized into chromosomes. So DNA plus protein, they make chromatin, and chromatin is organized into chromosomes. Okay, so your nucleus has multiple pores. So these are all the pores. So through these pores, things can go in and out of the nucleus. So nucleus is your site जहाँ पे आपकी transcription हो रही है. Nucleus is your site where your DNA is replicated. Yesterday we talked about replication. Okay, DNA is making its copy. Yesterday we talked about transcription, when your DNA is used to make RNA. That actually happens in the nucleus. Okay, and then you have endoplasmic reticulum. So I talked about endoplasmic reticulum are the most abundant kind of organelles inside the cell. Their membrane content is so much, many times more than the membrane content of the whole plasma membrane, right? So they occupy almost 1/10 of the volume of the cell. And what is their function? So we talked about their smooth endoplasmic reticulum and rough endoplasmic reticulum. So smooth endoplasmic reticulum, they store calcium. They are required for lipid synthesis. They degrade small, or they modify small molecules. In rough endoplasmic reticulum are the sites of protein synthesis. So your ribosomes are the organelles that actually carry out protein synthesis. Remember, we said DNA to RNA to protein. So जो RNA से प्रोटीन बनती है, this is where ribosomes are required. So ribosomes are responsible for making proteins. Okay. And then we have Golgi apparatus. So, you know, the proteins that are formed in the endoplasmic reticulum, on the endoplasmic reticulum, they can be slightly modified in the endoplasmic reticulum, and then they are passed on to Golgi. So Golgi में क्या होता है कि further उनकी modification होती है. So, you know, these flattened discs in the Golgi are called cisternae. क्या कहते हैं उनको? They are flattened membrane sacs. They receive proteins from the ER for further modification. ये उनकी modification करते हैं, and then you know they package them into these kind of vacuoles or vesicles, and then they transmit those vesicles to either to the outside of the cell or to different parts of the cell. So they are kind of post master inside the cell, जहाँ पे चीजें आती हैं और उन्हें package करते हैं और उनकी sorting करते हैं, and they send them to different places either within or outside the cell. Lysosomes, they are, as I said, 1 micrometer in diameter. They have single membrane. They contain digestive enzymes. जो भी हमने दो reactions की बात की थी, एक हमने कहा था condensation reaction और एक हमने कहा था hydrolytic. So condensation reaction, they form polymers, और जो hydrolytic reactions हैं, they degrade polymers. So the lysosome, they contain dozens of different hydrolytic enzymes, proteases, lipases, glycosidases. Different enzymes are present in the lysosomes. So वो क्या है कि फर्ज करें आपके पास एक मॉलिक्यूल है R1 R2, तो ये क्या करेंगे, वाटर ऐड करके उसको ब्रेक कर देंगे into two monomers. ठीक, इसी तरह अगर R1 to R5 है तो उनको छोटे छोटे उसके अंदर कर देंगे. So lysosomes are very important. Defects in the lysosomes can cause many human diseases. इसकी एग्जांपल यहाँ पे है. So this is I think eye cell disease or inclusion cell disease example. Where also this is, I think, Hurler's disease, where some of the glycosamine glycan, the carbohydrates are not broken down in the lysosomes. The mitochondria are site of energy synthesis, and we will talk about in the last lecture of this module in detail. They are the powerhouses. So we talked about that glucose is your source of energy. So glucose is broken down in the cytoplasm, and then part of that actually goes into the mitochondria. Okay, so cytoplasm क्या है कि ये आपका अगर सेल है, ये आपका न्यूक्लियस है, तो this whole area between the membrane and the nucleus is cytoplasm. So cytoplasm contains two things. एक है liquid part, that is cytosol, और एक उसके अंदर जो different organelles हैं वो उसके अंदर है. ठीक, so the liquid part or the watery part of the cytoplasm is called cytosol. So liver cells, I talked about, there can be 1,000 to 2,000 mitochondria per cell, and they have two membranes. One is outer membrane and the other is inner membrane. We'll talk about that in the 7th lecture. They produce energy inside the cell. Okay, and then you have these chloroplasts. So chloroplasts are also structured that are present in the plant cells that use sunlight to make their own energy. They also have an outer membrane. They also have kind of an inner membrane, and then they have these structures called thylakoids. So these are interlinked structures. So these are the sites जहाँ पे photosynthesis होती है. Okay. Okay. I think I will just mention these three structures. कि आपके पास, we talked about कि आपके पास microfilaments हैं, which are actin filaments. You have these, microtubules, and then you have these, these are microtubules, and then you have these intermediate filaments shown here. So this is one of the image that one of my PhD students, or two of the images that my PhD student took for his thesis, and this shows the, the red in this are actually the microtubules. So you see they are present throughout the cell, and the green here are actually the actin cytoskeleton. So you see they are mostly present at the under the membrane, and the blue in this case is the nucleus. So you see a beautiful image of that. So here I will end